this is the finale. I'm just moving you a little here. Okay. Hopefully this is the finale. I'm gonna try to power through and finish this out for you guys. I really do hope you have been enjoying it. Like I said, I wanted to do it with Spooktober, and I just couldn't make it work to my satisfaction as far as camera angles kind of go. So I'm just trying to get over myself and just realize everything will not be perfect all the time. And so here we are, and hopefully it's not too bad. So this is page 48. Francis Tumblety. In 1993, crime historian Stuart P. Evans purchased a batch of correspondence that belonged to journalist George Sims. Among the papers was a letter written in 1913 by Chief Inspector John Littlechild, who at the time of the Jack the Ripper crimes had been the head of the Metropolitan Police's secret department. Littlechild was responding to an inquiry from Sims, asking if he had heard of a Dr. D, evidently a reference to M.J. Druitt, in connection with the Whitechapel murders. Littlechild replied that although he had never heard of a Dr. D amongst the suspects, and to my mind a very likely one was a Dr. T, like T like Tom, not D like dog, was an American quack named Tumblety. According to Littlechild, Tumblety was arrested in connection with unnatural offenses. Remanded on bail, he jumped bail and got away to Bologna. Alright. He shortly left there and was never heard of afterward. It was believed he committed suicide, but certain it is from that time the Ripper murders came to an end. At first glance, Tumblety is another promising suspect. He was charged with acts of gross indecency with a number of males on 7 November 1888. His arrest and subsequent suicide would explain the sudden cessation of the murders. However, upon closer inspection, the case against him becomes incredibly flimsy. Contrary to Littlechild's assertion that he was never heard of after leaving Bologna, he did in fact set sail for New York, where the American press soon were reporting his possible involvement in the Whitechapel murders. From the moment he arrived, he was kept under surveillance by Chief Inspector Burns of the New York Police. Burns is on record saying that there is no proof of his complicity in the Whitechapel murders, and the crime for which he was under bond in London was not extraditable. Burns appears to have doubted Tumblety's guilt, and even, according to the New York Times, laughed at the suggestion that he was the Whitechapel murderer. A claim made by those who favored Tumblety as a suspect is that he collected medical specimens, including uteri. Ew. However, there is no proof of this. The allegation that he did was contained in an account given by Colonial C.S. Dunham to the Williamsport Sunday Grit, in which he told of attending a dinner in which Tumblety had fiercely denounced all women, especially fallen women. According to Dunham, Tumblety then took his guests to his office, where he showed them a dozen or more jars containing the uteri of every class of woman. Ew, dude. It should, however, be noted that Dunham's veracity is, to say the least, questionable. He was a known confidence trickster who only made his claims after press allegations linked Tumblety to the Whitechapel murders. There is therefore a distinct possibility he invented the story to cash in on Tumblety's sudden notoriety. This is Tumblety here on the right. Another oft-quoted piece of evidence against Tumblety is that people who knew him thought he was the killer. Again, this is mere hearsay. I give my name that all know of me, so history do tell what love can do to a gentleman born. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. There's never been any suggestion of Maybrick's being Jack the Ripper until his alleged diary resurfaced in 1992. So the case against him has always depended upon proving he was indeed the journal's author, a task which has been far from straightforward. Initially, several experts who examined the journal agreed it was of the right time period. However, they stressed that a detailed forensic analysis was necessary to establish exactly when it had been written, and the subsequent scientific evidence has proved, to say the least, contradictory. The diary's provenance was not helped by the fact that Michael Barrett later confessed in the Liverpool Daily Post he had forged it. However, he then retracted his confession, and his estranged wife claimed her family had possessed it since the Second World War. The diary's provenance and age aside, many of the details it contained about the crimes, far from demonstrating first-hand knowledge, are evidently gleaned from press reports and later accounts of the murders. As a result, the diary repeats some common errors and misconceptions concerning the Jack the Ripper cases and his victims. In Mary Kelly's case, for example, the diarist says he placed the parts of her body all over the room, and, having cut off her breasts and kissed them for a while, he placed them on the bedside table. The idea of Mary Kelly's body parts being strewn around her room is common fallacy and is demonstrably untrue. Likewise, her breasts were not placed on the bedside table, but were in fact found beneath her. This is just one example of several such falsities that find their way into the supposed confession, in which cast doubt upon the author's viability as a suspect. There is, however, another intriguing piece of memorabilia that links Maybrick to the Jack the Ripper crimes. In 1993, Albert Johnson purchased an antique gold watch, on which the inside he found scratched the initials of Jack the Ripper's 5 victims, together with the signature J. Maybrick and the words, "I am Jack." As with the diary, the watch has been subjected to scientific analysis, and the scratches have been found to be compatible with the period 1888 to 1889, although these findings have been disputed. But the watch's appearance so soon after the diary made public aroused a great deal of suspicion, and whereas it is possible they were both created at the same time, their usefulness in proving Maybrick's guilt depends on proving they are genuine, and this has never been satisfactorily done. The arguments both for and against the viability of Maybrick's suspects continue, and the general consensus is that the diary is a forgery, although whether done in the 19th or late 20th century is still contested. One thing is, however, certain: we have not heard the last of James Maybrick as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and I'm sorry if you could just hear Lucy howling. I heard her howling, so you probably also did. She is downstairs with Sean. The Royal Ripper and the Freemasons. So this is Prince Albert Edward Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson. And this is Sir William Cole, the royal physician and sometime Ripper suspect. I'm gonna shift a little here. Leaning over this book is quite uncomfortable. Okay, but the print is so tiny, I have to. Perhaps the most oft-quoted piece of Jack the Ripper misinformation is that he was a member of the royal family. What? I did not know that. And the reason he was never caught was because the various British authorities conspired to suppress such an awful and inconvenient truth. The royal in question was Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, grandson of Queen Victoria is hardly any proof of guilt. That aside, there is no hard historical evidence that anyway links the prince to the Whitechapel murders. On the contrary, his whereabouts at the times of the crimes are well known, and they emphatically rule him out as a suspect. On 31 August 1888, the morning that Mary Nichols was murdered, he was staying with the Viscount Down at Danby Lodge in Yorkshire. On 8 September, the date of Annie Chapman's death, he was at the cavalry barracks in York. Queen Victoria noted in her journal that she had lunched with him at Abergildy in Scotland on September 30th, in the early hours of which Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes had died. And finally, on the day of Mary Keller's murder, November 9, he was at Sandringham in Norfolk. So tempting as it is to believe that a syphilitic member of the royal family was Jack the Ripper, there's absolutely nothing that supports such a theory. Albert Victor's name, however, turns up yet again as a part of an even more convoluted, not to say fanciful theory, which maintains that the killings were nothing less than a masonic, I'm sure I said that wrong, conspiracy to avert a potential royal scandal. The premise behind it is that there had been a secret and illegal marriage between Albert Victor and a young Catholic woman named Annie Elizabeth Crook, by whom he had a baby daughter. The fact that an heir to the throne of England had married and sired a child by a Catholic prompted the authorities to act. God, why do people have to get involved in other people's marriages? Ugh. Annie was incarcerated in a lunatic asylum where Sir William Gull, Queen Victoria's surgeon, lobotomized her to destroy her memory. That's terrible. This turned her into a gibbering imbecile who could never be taken seriously in anything she said. Ugh. But her child's nursemaid, Mary Kelly, fled to the East End, where she fell in with a gaggle of drunken prostitutes, told them what she knew, and together they hatched a plot to blackmail the government. Robert Cecil, the Prime Minister, a Freemason, enlisted the assistance of fellow Mason Sir William Gull, and set him to the task of silencing the troublesome crones. Gull inveigled the artist Walter Sickert into the plot because he knew what Mary Kelly looked like. They were driven around the East End by John Nelty, Albert Victor's coachman, and one by one the extortionists were hunted down and lured into the royal carriage, where Gull murdered them and mutilated them in accordance with Masonic ritual. Netley then disposed of the bodies at the sites where they were found. What a theory, y'all. Now, no historic evidence has ever been found that supports the idea of an official conspiracy. It is difficult to believe that, with the number of people involved, some evidence for it would not have surfaced by now. As far as the murders being carried out in a carriage is concerned, the medical evidence disputes this, and it is certain that all of the women died at the spots where their bodies were discovered. Furthermore, the injuries inflicted on the victims were evidently the results of frenzied attacks, not calculated ritual. All in all, the Masonic conspiracy is an entertaining hypothesis, but it consists of too much supposition and too many fallacies, not to mention a considerable number of demonstrably disprovable facts that disqualify it from being considered anything like a final solution. Man, I was fascinated. I don't know about you guys, but yeah, I was blown away by that. Like I said, I didn't read this before I decided to share it with you. Walter Sickert. Over the years, several authors have linked the artist Walter highlights a series of pictures that Sickert painted, which were inspired by the murder of Camden Town prostitute Emily Dimmock in 1907, for which she claims to bear a striking resemblance to the post-mortem photographs of the Ripper victims. Sickert was most certainly interested in murder and depicting menace, but this hardly makes him guilty of such a crime. Another major problem with the theory of Sickert's having been Jack the Ripper is that he may not have even been in England when the murders were committed. A number of letters from several family members refer to his holidaying in France during a period that corresponds with most of the Ripper murders. Although it has been suggested he might have traveled to London in order to commit the murders and then returned to France, no evidence has been produced to suggest that he actually did so. Cornwell also contends that Sickert was responsible for writing most of the Jack the Ripper correspondence and frequently uses statements made in those letters to strengthen her case against him. Authorities on the case, as well as the police at the time, nearly all share the opinion that none of the letters, not even the Dear Boss missive gave the Ripper his name, were the work of the killer. In addition, there is the problem that the style of the letters varies so greatly in grammatical structure, spelling, handwriting, it is almost impossible for a single author to have created all of them. In her quest to prove Sickert's guilt, Cornwell also funded DNA tests on numerous stamps and envelopes, which she believed Sickert had licked, and compared the DNA to that found on the Ripper letters. Interestingly, a possible match was found with the stamp that Dr. Openshaw letter. Critics, however, have pointed out that the DNA comparisons focused on mitochondrial DNA, which could be shared by anything from between 1 and 10% of the population, so it was hardly unique to him. Another intriguing find was that the Dr. Openshaw letter, 2 other Jack the Ripper letters, and 8 letters penned by Walter Sickert were all written on paper that bore the watermark of the Aberdeen paper manufacturer Alexander Peary and Sons. But dissenters argue that the paper was widely available. The Sickert letters were written between 1885 and 1887, and that he was probably not using that paper in 1888. Sickert may well have been responsible for writing some of the Jack the Ripper correspondence, but since it is generally agreed upon that none of it was written by the murderer, it only makes him guilty of having composed hoax letters. The claim that he was also guilty of the Whitechapel murders is far from proven, and the Jack the Ripper case is anything but closed. Okay, let's see. I think we only have like 2 or 3 pages left. Yep. Okay, 3 more. You guys ready to be done? Or are you enjoying this series? I'm learning things, which I like. Why the Ripper was never caught. The Victorian police have over the years been subjected to a barrage of criticism for their inability to catch Jack the Ripper. Many of the charges leveled against them are largely undeserved, and some downright inaccurate. For a start, the science of criminal investigation was largely in its infancy at the time. Forensics, offender profiling, DNA profiling, even fingerprinting were not established methods of crime detection. Furthermore, the murders occurred in one of the most densely populated quarters of London, not to mention a district where a large criminal community had vested interest in providing little assistance to the police as possible. Numerous amateur sleuths were also conducting their own endeavors to bring the killer to justice, but far from helping the police, their activities often had the opposite effect and came close to overwhelming the investigation, with a deluge of bogus information and duff leads. As Inspector Frederick George Eberline later observed, we were almost lost in theories. There were so many of them. The area itself aided the killer's escape from the scenes of his crimes, made up as it was of an intricate warren of alleyways and passages, few of which were lit at night. At the height of the murders, American journalist R. Harding Davis was shown around the area by Inspector Henry Moore. The detective led him through a network of narrow passageways as dark and loathsome as the great network of sewers that stretches underneath. Moore told Davis how his men had formed a circle around the spot where one of the murders had taken place, guarding, they thought, every entrance and approach, but within a matter of minutes they found 50 people inside the circle who had come in through 2 passageways, which, according to Moore, his men could not find. The layout of the area might have aided the killer's escapes, but the victims themselves inadvertently provided the perfect locations for his crimes. All but one of these victims conducted their acts of prostitution in dark courtyards and secluded corners of the neighborhood. By the very nature of what they did and the local knowledge required, they knew how to take their murderer to places where there was little danger of interruption. As one police officer put it, it's not as if he had to wait for his chance. They make that chance for him. Another major problem faced by the police was that the killer left no clues behind. As Moore confided to Davis, we have no relics. He never leaves so much as a rag behind. There's no more a clue to that chap's identity than there is to the identity of some murderer who will kill someone 100 years from now. A frequent bone of contention in the area was that authorities refused to sanction a reward for information that might lead to the killer's apprehension. The foreman of the jurors at Annie Chapman's inquest even went so far as to express the opinion that the murders of both Nichols and Chapman could have been prevented had a reward been offered in the wake of Martha Tabram's murder. It was in fact official government policy not to offer rewards on the grounds that they simply encourage people to give false information in the hope of financial gain. It is also worth noting that several private rewards were put up, and following Catherine Eddowes' murder, the City of London offered £500 for information, but neither of these produced any tangible results. The fact is that with resources available to them at the time, and without any clues that might lead them to the killer, there was not a great deal police could do other than increase the number of uniformed and plainclothes officers in the district and hope that they might either glean a vital clue or be on hand to catch the killer the next time he murdered. But since that never happened, Jack the Ripper evaded capture. The Press and the Ripper. This is W.T. Steed, the father of investigative journalism, it says. Here's a newspaper seller, little newsboy. It says, murder in Whitechapel. The Jack the Ripper murders generated a huge amount of press coverage, and at the height of the panic, journalists were all over the world converged on the East End to report on the murders, as well as on the social conditions they found there. It quickly became apparent to editors that these crimes sold newspapers, and since the public possessed an insatiable appetite for every salacious detail, to some, the police's seeming inability to catch the killer presented the perfect opportunity to settle old scores. To others, the crime created a means of exposing the plight of the East End's poor to the public at large. Still, moreover, found themselves the opportunity to test their powers of invention. The Metropolitan Police were suspicious of newspaper exposure and became very guarded about giving out information. Their belief was that the press coverage might prove detrimental to the lines of inquiry. Worse still, could have alert suspects to the fact that they were onto them. The press reacted to this lack of cooperation by finding even more devious ways of ferreting out leads. Journalists would shadow detectives in the hope of securing that elusive scoop. They would attempt to bribe individual constables or loosen their tongues with drink. Some even wandered around dressed as prostitutes, hoping to be approached by the killer. What? Of course, checkbook journalism in the area, blighted by poverty, could yield results. But those results might prove a double-edged sword, as people frequently told journalists what they thought they wanted to hear, or exaggerated their roles to maximize their time in the spotlight. If all else failed, the one sure way for a journalist to ensure that the story met a deadline was either to rely on local gossip, or simply make something up. Indeed, several of the falsies, misconceptions, and inaccuracies about the Ripper murders, which appeared in the press in the aftermath of the killings, have been repeated time and time again in subsequent books. Some newspapers were appalled by the sensationalism that their competitors and worried about the effects it was having. The Star's campaign to alert the public to the menace of the leather apron is illustrative of this. The Daily News was quick to point out that the public are looking journalist's power of invention, had it not been for a journalist's powers of invention, there's a good chance that Jack the Ripper murders would not have achieved their posthumous notoriety. When the police released the Dear Boss letter, its chilling moniker was seized upon by the press at large as the perfect name to convey to their readers the horror of what was happening in Whitechapel. As the journalist George Sims observed, Jack the Ripper is a hero of the hour. What? A gruesome wag, a grim practical joker, has succeeded in getting enormous amount of fun out of a postcard which he sent to the Central News. The fun is his own and no one shares in it, but he must be gloating demonically at present moment in the state of the perturbation. What? I don't know how to say that word. In which he has flung the public mind. The police themselves were convinced almost from the outset that the letter was a hoax, and it had in fact been written by a journalist, and several officers even claimed to know who he was. Now his identity is of little consequence. What is of consequence is his legacy, for whoever he might have been, that journalist created a name which elevated a homicidal East End nobody into the realm of legend. Okay guys, so we're gonna finish it up with Jack the Ripper's London today. At first glance, it might appear that little, if anything, of Jack the Ripper's London has survived, whereas this is most certainly true with regard to the actual murder sites, all of which have now been obliterated. There are still sections of the East End that have changed little since 1888. Bucks Row, where Mary Nichols died, disappeared, in name at least, shortly after her death. The local residents became ashamed of their sudden notoriety and successfully petitioned the council to change its name to Durward Street. The small, litter-strewn car park now stands on the murder site itself. One building, however, has survived the immediate vicinity. The looming bulk of the board school towers over the street just as it did in 1888, although today it has been converted into flats. A short distance away, the London Hospital still stands on Whitechapel High Street. It was here when Emma Smith, the first Whitechapel murders victim, died, and here worked Dr. Openshaw, whose opinion was sought in connection with the piece of the kidney that George Lusk had received along with his letter from hell. Closer to the city of London, and also on the Whitechapel High Street, the White Hart Pub, the cellar of which suspect George Chapman worked as a barber in 1890, still dispenses frothing tankards of ale to thirsty Ripper enthusiasts. Adjoining it is the sinister arch through which Martha Tabram took her soldier client in the early hours of 7 August 1888. It leads into the cobblestone Gunthorpe Street, where her body was discovered in George Yard, in which at night can be just as sinister and threatening as it was in 1888. Round the corner on Brick Lane, the Shiraz Curry restaurant now occupies the building that was the Frying Pan Pub. Here, Mary Nichols drank away her DOS money on the night of her murder. Close scrutiny of its upper stories reveals that 2 crossed frying pans still adorn its upper gable, along with its original name, Ye Frying Pan. A rather ugly brewery building stands on the site of 29 Hanbury, in the backyard of which the body of Annie Chapman was found at 6 a.m. The opposite section of Hanbury Street, the south side, is more or less intact, so it's possible to at least gain the impression of what the north side would have looked like at the time of the murder. Nearby, on busy Commercial Street, the 10 Bells Pub, linked with the final hours of both Annie Chapman and Mary Kelly, is still doing a roaring trade, although it has made a concerted effort to distance itself from Ripper-related post. On opposite, it stands one of the neighborhood's most poignant buildings, the soaring white tower of Christ Church, featured here on the left side of the page. It dominates its surroundings today just as it did in 1888, a towering and breathtaking edifice at which Jack the Ripper's victims might well have glanced at almost a daily basis. Of Burner Street, where Elizabeth Stride was killed on 30 September, nothing has survived. The site itself is now occupied by a school playground. Likewise, Mitre Square, where Catherine Eddowes became the Ripper's next victim, Church, a car park now occupies the site of Dorset Street, where Mary Kelly was murdered on 9 November. A food warehouse now stands over the site of Miller's Court, where her body was found. But the former Providence Row night shelter still looms over Dorset Street's west end. It is the only building in the immediate vicinity that connects to that long-ago night when a lone cry of murder spelled the end of the Jack the Ripper's reign of terror. Alright guys, I want to thank you so much for joining me on our journey through Jack the Ripper, the case book. I thought it was a pretty cool addition to my channel. Like I said, I do wish some of these letters were a bit more legible. I honestly did not look into them because I really wanted to share my experience with you guys, so I didn't realize. I thought it would be more